For roughly 20 years, if you watched a Tyrannosaurus Rex documentary, there was a decent chance it spent real time on a supposed scientific controversy. Was T-Rex a fearsome apex predator? Or was it actually more of an oversized vulture? A scavenger too slow and poorly equipped to hunt, living off carcasses it found rather than animals it killed? It got framed as a genuine, unresolved fight between two camps of paleontologists. Here's the thing almost none of those documentaries told you clearly. That fight barely happened the way it was presented. And that's actually the smallest of several things about this animal that have been meaningfully revised, corrected, or outright rewritten in just the past couple of years, some of it within the last 6 months. This is the most intensively studied dinosaur that has ever existed, and huge pieces of its basic biology are still, right now, being actively argued over and updated. Let's start with the scavenger question, because it's the one most people already think they know the answer to. The idea is closely associated with paleontologist Jack Horner, who spent roughly 2 decades starting with his 1993 book, The Complete T-Rex, publicly arguing the case in talks with titles like Steak Knives, Beady Eyes, and Tiny Little Arms, a portrait of T-Rex as a scavenger. His argument rested on a handful of points. Tyrannosaurus had unusually large olfactory structures, suggesting a strong sense of smell, the kind of tool a scavenger used to locate carrion from a distance. Its arms were comically short, seemingly useless for grappling struggling prey. Its femur was actually longer than its shin bone, a proportion more associated with slow, steady walkers than fast pursuit predators. Its teeth were built more like bone-crushing tools than precision-slicing blades, arguably more useful for extracting every last bit of nutrition, including marrow, from an already dead carcass. And at the time he was making this argument, there was no confirmed fossil evidence of a T-Rex bite mark on a living animal that had actually survived the attack. Only bite marks on bone that could have come from scavenging a corpse. Here's a detail that tends to get left out of the retelling. Horner himself, in that same 1993 book, wrote something close to this admission directly, that he wasn't fully convinced T-Rex was only a scavenger, and that he'd sometimes argue the position just to be contrary and get his colleagues arguing. The original scavenger claim functioned, at least in part, as a deliberate teaching device, a way of pushing students and the public to actually examine evidence rather than simply accept the default assumption that a big predator with big teeth must be an active hunter. It was framed publicly, especially in media coverage, as a hard scientific position. Internally, even its own author treated it with more nuance than that. And the rebuttals, once they arrived, were substantial. Paleontologist Thomas Holtz published a detailed 2008 chapter systematically working through Horner's individual points and finding each one weaker than presented. But the more dramatic pushback came from direct fossil evidence. In 2013, a team led by Robert De Palma published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences describing a broken T-Rex tooth crown found embedded directly between two fused tail vertebrae of a hadrosaur, almost certainly Edmontosaurus. Crucially, the bone around that embedded tooth shows clear signs of healing. The animal survived being bitten badly by a Tyrannosaurus and lived long enough afterward for new bone to grow around the broken-off tooth still lodged inside it. That's about as direct as evidence gets. A predator attacked a living animal. The animal got away, and the proof is fused permanently into its own skeleton. A separate 2008 description of a Triceratops skull found in Montana documented healed infected puncture wounds on one of its brow horns, with a missing section and parallel scrape marks spaced almost exactly the width apart you'd expect from Tyrannosaurus teeth. Another animal that survived an actual attack from this predator. There's a more sophisticated piece of this story worth including too, because it complicates the leg proportion argument in a genuinely interesting way, rather than simply dismissing it. A 2021 biomechanical study modeled Tyrannosaurus's tail as a kind of tuned pendulum, the same basic physics used to calculate a human's most energy-efficient natural walking pace, and found its preferred lowest energy cost walking speed came out to roughly 4.6 kilometers an hour, slower than a brisk human walk. That doesn't mean this animal was slow in an absolute sense, since separate biomechanical modeling puts a plausible top speed somewhere around 22 miles an hour, well beyond human running speed, just nowhere near the wildly exaggerated numbers that show up in some pop culture depictions. What that combination of numbers actually points toward is neither a pure sprinting ambush hunter nor a shuffling scavenger, but something closer to an efficient long-distance walker, an animal built more like an endurance traveler, covering large territory economically than a drag racer explosively chasing down prey over short bursts. That's a considerably more precise, more interesting picture than the binary the popular scavenger versus predator framing offers. So, where does the actual expert consensus sit today? About as far from a genuine, ongoing controversy as you can get. Thomas Holtz has put it plainly that Tyrannosaurus obviously wouldn't have passed up a free meal, while also clearly having real anatomical adaptations suited to active hunting. Even Horner himself is on record agreeing the animal was almost certainly both. The honest framing isn't who won this debate. It's that a media-friendly binary got repeated in documentary after documentary for 2 decades, long after the paleontologists actually doing the research had mostly moved past treating it as a genuine open question. Now the arms, because there's a genuinely fresh answer here. Published so recently, it's very likely never appeared in another video on this topic before this one. The history of proposed explanations is worth walking through on its own because several of them are stranger than you'd expect. Early 20th century paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn floated the idea that the arms functioned as pectoral claspers, used to hold on to a mate during reproduction. An idea that's since been dismissed outright, since the arms are simply too short to physically reach around another Tyrannosaurus's body. Other proposals over the decades have included the arms serving as a lever to help push a resting prone animal back up onto its feet, a restraint tool for holding down smaller struggling prey during a killing bite, and even a hypothesis that shorter arms were less likely to get accidentally bitten off by rival Tyrannosaurus crowding around the same carcass during group feeding. In 2017, researcher Stephen Stanley proposed a more aggressive function entirely, arguing the arms, while short, were robust and equipped with roughly 4-inch claws, mounted on an unusually mobile ball and socket style shoulder joint, potentially built for close-range slashing rather than grasping. That idea remains genuinely contested, with researchers including Holt skeptical that an adult Tyrannosaurus would have relied on its arms as a primary weapon at all. The most current, best supported answer comes from a study published in May of 2026, in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, examining 85 different theropod dinosaur species. The researchers found that dramatically reduced near vestigial forelimbs evolved independently in at least 5 separate unrelated theropod lineages, including the branch that produced Tyrannosaurus. And in every single one of those independent cases, forelimb reduction happened in step with increasing skull robustness and increasing overall body size. Critically, when the researchers isolated which factor correlated most strongly with smaller arms, it wasn't body size on its own. It was skull robustness specifically, and Tyrannosaurus ranked at the very top of every species sampled for that measurement. The proposed mechanism is a genuine biomechanical trade-off, not simply an evolutionary oversight. As prey animals, especially large plant-eating dinosaurs, got bigger over time, the jaws became the primary tool actually capable of killing them, since grasping or restraining a multi-ton animal with a pair of comparatively small forelimbs became mechanically close to pointless. Natural selection across 5 separate lineages independently appears to have repeatedly favored investing growth resources into heavier, more powerful skulls and jaws at the direct expense of forelimb size. The arms didn't become useless by accident. They shrank because the jaws took over their job and kept the resources that would otherwise have gone toward keeping the arms larger. And it's worth being clear that short doesn't mean weak here either. Muscle attachment, scarring on the arm bones, shows well-developed flexor and bicep musculature, with biomechanical estimates suggesting each arm could generate a curling force on the order of roughly 400 pounds, genuinely powerful for its size. Just no longer built to do the job the skull had already taken over. The bite itself is where this animal's raw physical numbers are most famous, and the actual research is more nuanced than the headline figures usually convey. A detailed 2017 study combining CT scans of fossil skulls, muscle reconstruction modeled from Tyrannosaurus's closest living relatives, alligators, crocodiles, and birds, and direct analysis of actual bite and tooth drag marks preserved on fossilized bone, calculated a bite force ranging from roughly 8,500 up to about 34,500 newtons, translating to somewhere between about 1,900 and 7,800 pounds of force, depending on exactly where along the jaw the bite landed. The more biomechanically important number, though, isn't total force. It's tooth pressure. How much of that force gets concentrated into the small contact area of an individual tooth? And there the study found peak pressures reaching close to 3,000 megapascals in the neighborhood of 431,000 pounds per square inch. A genuinely record-setting figure for a terrestrial animal. That distinction matters because a raw bite force alone doesn't explain how an animal actually crushes solid bone. Pressure concentration does, and it's the reason Tyrannosaurus could reliably splinter and consume the skeletal remains of its prey in a way most predators, living or extinct, simply can't manage. It's worth flagging that these are model-dependent estimates built from careful reconstruction, not a direct measurement anyone could ever actually take, and that the numbers have shifted meaningfully over time as methods improved. An earlier 1996 estimate landed considerably lower, in the range of 6,400 to 13,400 newtons, using less detailed modeling. And it's worth one honest correction to the popular framing too. As devastating as this bite is among land animals, it isn't actually the most powerful bite in the history of life on Earth. That title, by current estimates, likely belongs to extinct marine predators. The giant crocodilian Deinosuchus, estimated at roughly double Tyrannosaurus's bite force, and the giant shark Megalodon, estimated higher still. Tyrannosaurus holds the record among things that walked on land. Once you widen the comparison to the ocean, it drops to third. Now the growth story, because this is the single freshest, most substantially revised piece of this entire episode, and it changes a narrative that's been repeated in nearly every T-Rex documentary made in the last 20 years. The foundational study here came out in 2004, based on detailed bone histology, essentially reading growth rings inside the bones, the same way you'd count rings in a tree, applied to 7 individual specimens of known relative age. That research found evidence of a dramatic adolescent growth spurt starting around age 14, during which the specimen known as Sue gained an estimated 2 kilograms of body weight per day at peak, reaching over 5,600 kilograms by age 18 and a half. Under that original model, Tyrannosaurus reached its full adult size, upward of 8,000 kilograms, within roughly 2 decades, with a maximum estimated lifespan around 28 years. Sue herself standing as the oldest confirmed individual on record. That growth spurt narrative, a teenage dinosaur putting on weight explosively fast before leveling off into adulthood, has been the standard repeated explanation in essentially every piece of popular T-Rex content made since. In January of 2026, a considerably more comprehensive study involving Jack Horner himself as a co-author, this time working from bone histology data, examined the largest sample yet assembled, 17 individual specimens, using multiple statistical growth models cross-checked against each other. The result meaningfully revises the original picture. Tyrannosaurus, according to this new analysis, likely took closer to 40 years to reach full adult size, roughly 15 years longer than the 2004 model suggested, with growth only fully leveling off somewhere between 35 and 40 years of age. That's not a minor tweak. It roughly doubles the previously accepted timeline for how long this animal took to actually finish growing. Sexual maturity, based on separate reproductive tissue evidence, still appears to arrive earlier, around age 18, meaning this animal was likely reproductively mature for close to 2 decades before it finished growing into its full adult size. An interesting biological detail on its own. And no confirmed specimen shows solid evidence of surviving much past roughly 30 years, which researchers currently interpret as reflecting a genuine biological ceiling on lifespan, rather than simply being an artifact of which fossils happen to survive and get found. It's worth being upfront that this new growth model is genuinely recent, published only months before this recording, and hasn't yet had the extended period of independent cross-checking by other labs that the original 2004 model eventually received over its own 20-year run. It's the current best answer. It may not be the final one. What was this animal actually sensing as it walked through its world? Its sense of smell has a real scientific basis. Tyrannosaurids do show notably enlarged olfactory structures relative to body size. But the popular version of this fact tends to run away from the actual data. A more precise, genomic-based estimate puts Tyrannosaurus at somewhere around 620 to 645 functional smell receptor genes, a real above average sense of smell for its size, but genuinely comparable to a modern chicken or a domestic cat, not the vulture detecting carrion from miles. A way superpower that gets repeated constantly. Its vision is more genuinely impressive than most people assume. A detailed 2006 study using full skull reconstructions to map out each theropod species' actual visual field found that Tyrannosaurus, along with its closest tyrannosaurid relatives, had a binocular overlap somewhere between 45 and 60 degrees, comparable to or even exceeding a modern hawk. Genuinely strong depth perception for an animal its size, a real, well-supported finding, rather than an exaggerated one. Hearing is a little less certain, based mostly on the shape of the inner ear rather than direct measurement. But the anatomy suggests particular sensitivity to low-frequency sound, consistent with long-range or possibly even ground-transmitted communication. And here's a detail that genuinely undercuts nearly every piece of pop culture depicting this animal at once. Tyrannosaurus almost certainly did not roar the way it's shown roaring in essentially every movie ever made about it. A 2023 study examining vocalization anatomy across more than 200 living bird and crocodilian species found that closed-mouth vocalization, deep booms and inflated throat calls made without ever fully opening the beak or jaw, evolved independently at least 16 separate times across that broader lineage, and that the syrinx, the specialized vocal organ modern birds use to produce their more complex open-mouth calls, appears to have evolved only after the evolutionary split between the bird lineage and the crocodilian lineage. Since non-avian dinosaurs sit on the other side of that split, the strong implication is that Tyrannosaurus almost certainly lacked a syrinx entirely, and therefore couldn't have produced anything resembling the open-mouth, cinematic roar every single film adaptation has given it. A closely related 2023 study on a fossilized ankylosaur's preserved throat structure supports the idea that bird-like closed-mouth sounds were physically achievable without a syrinx at all. The best current guess for how this animal actually sounded is something considerably stranger and quieter than a raw, deep, closed-mouth booms, hisses, or low infrasonic rumbles, closer to what a modern ostrich or crocodile produces than anything in a movie theater. Did it hunt alone or in groups? This is a place where it's genuinely important to separate what's actually been shown from what gets casually assumed by extension. There is real, solid, peer-reviewed evidence for group behavior among tyrannosaurids generally. A bone bed in Alberta, first excavated back in 1910 and reanalyzed multiple times since, preserves somewhere between 12 and 24 individuals of a tyrannosaurid called Albertosaurus, spanning a wide range of ages. A separate Montana site preserved 3 individual Daspletosaurus, an adult, a juvenile, and an intermediate-aged animal found together. A 2021 study documented a genuine mass death site in Utah containing 4 to 5 individuals of yet another tyrannosaurid, Teratophonius, with multiple independent lines of geological evidence supporting a real simultaneous group death rather than unrelated animals accumulating over time. And a set of fossilized trackways in British Columbia, described in 2014, shows 3 tyrannosaurid-type footprint trails moving in the same direction at matched walking speeds simultaneously. The first direct locomotor evidence for coordinated group movement in this broader family of dinosaurs. None of those 4 pieces of evidence, and it's worth being precise about this, rather than blurring it the way a lot of documentaries do, actually involve Tyrannosaurus rex itself. They involve other genera within the same broader Tyrannosaurid family at different times and different locations. The evidence specifically tying group or social behavior to Tyrannosaurus rex is considerably thinner, limited to a handful of sites with multiple individuals found close together in river deposit rock, a type of geology that can also simply accumulate unrelated carcasses over time through ordinary taphonomic chance rather than genuine social grouping. And some researchers have been openly skeptical of TRex family interpretations drawn from those specific sites. The honest current answer is that Tyrannosaurus almost certainly had close relatives capable of at least occasional group behavior, based on solid, direct fossil evidence for those other species specifically, and that extending that conclusion to Tyrannosaurus rex itself is a reasonable inference by analogy, not something backed by an equally strong T-Rex specific bone bed of its own, at least not yet. On skin and feathers, we've actually already covered the core direct evidence on this channel in our episode on Utyrannus, so we won't rewalk the whole argument here. The short version, for anyone catching this one first, the best direct fossil evidence specifically for Tyrannosaurus skin impressions from a specimen called Y-Rex shows plain unfeathered scales across the neck, hip, and tail regions, and no major new direct evidence has emerged specifically for this animal since that 2017 study. It's worth restating the honest caveat one more time. Those sampled regions don't cover the entire body, so a partially feathered back, or feathers present only at a younger life stage and lost with age, genuinely can't be ruled out by the evidence currently available. Scaly in the parts we've actually found isn't the same claim as scaly everywhere, on every individual, at every age. There's one more genuinely current thread worth closing on, because it's still being actively fought over in published literature as we speak. In 2022, a team led by Gregory Paul proposed splitting Tyrannosaurus rex into 3 separate species, based on variation in femur thickness and tooth count across a sample of 38 specimens. It got real media attention. It also got a substantial direct rebuttal, led by paleontologist Thomas Carr, drawing on his own prior analysis covering close to 1,850 separate morphological measurements across the available specimens, finding no statistically defensible basis for the proposed split at all, with Carr characterizing the original proposal's supporting patterns as, in his own words, shades of grey and shapes in clouds. As things currently stand, that 3-species proposal has not gained acceptance among the broader field, and the overwhelming majority of working paleontologists still treat Tyrannosaurus rex as a single species. It's worth noting, though, that the brand new 2026 growth study we covered earlier deliberately uses the phrase the Tyrannosaurus rex species complex in its own title. A hedge suggesting the underlying question of exactly how much genuine biological variation exists within this species isn't entirely closed, even while the specific 3-way split itself remains rejected. Separately, in January of 2024, researchers described an entirely new, closely related, giant tyrannosaurian species from New Mexico, predating Tyrannosaurus rex by roughly 6 to 7 million years, while reaching a comparably enormous size recovered as this animal's closest sister species and suggesting the specific lineage that eventually produced Tyrannosaurus may have originated considerably further south than researchers previously assumed. And a 2024 statistical modeling study, building on earlier population estimates suggesting something on the order of 2.5 billion Tyrannosaurus rex individuals, may have existed across the species' entire run on Earth, calculated that the largest individual that theoretically could have existed at the extreme statistical tail end of that population may have reached somewhere around 15,000 kilograms and over 15 meters long, nearly double the size of Sue or Scotty, the largest confirmed specimens currently known. The researchers were quick to note that finding an actual fossil of an animal that extreme is, statistically, exceedingly unlikely given current fossil collection rates, which means the biggest Tyrannosaurus rex science has ever actually found in the ground almost certainly wasn't the biggest one that ever lived. It's just the biggest one anyone's been lucky enough to dig up so far. So, an animal at the center of a scavenger versus predator debate that barely existed the way 2 decades of documentaries presented it. A bite that's record-setting among land animals, but not actually the strongest bite this planet has ever produced. Arms that turned out to be a deliberate biomechanical trade-off, confirmed by research published only months ago, rather than an evolutionary joke. A growth timeline that got roughly doubled by new research this year alone. A sense of smell that's genuinely good, not genuinely supernatural. A sound that almost certainly never resembled the roar you've heard in every single movie about it. Real, solid evidence of group behavior in this animal's own close relatives, and considerably weaker, more contested evidence for the species itself. And an active, ongoing argument still playing out in published journals right now over how much genetic and physical variation actually sits inside the single name Tyrannosaurus rex. This is the most famous, most exhaustively studied dinosaur that has ever existed. And it's still changing in real, meaningful ways, faster than most people realize. All right, we've spent 4 videos in a row now firmly on land, so it's time to head somewhere considerably smaller and considerably creepier. Next time, we're finally getting to the animal that currently holds, or at least shares, the record for largest arthropod ever confirmed to exist. A title we first brought up all the way back during our Jacalopterus episode. Arthropleura, a millipede roughly the length of a small car, and exactly how something built like that managed to grow so large in the first place. That one's next. Let me know in the comments what you want catalogued after that. And subscribe to Claw Catalog so you're here for it.